Hello, everybody. We are coming in today for the fifth video in our Presidents series, which we really haven't touched since last year now, because I think the last Presidents video we did on James Madison was on New Year's Eve. So technically, this is our first of the Presidents videos for this year. So I wanted to go ahead and get the fifth video done for this week. And our fifth president, if this is probably the first one that people really aren't going to know at all. So this is probably going to be a lot of new information coming to those who really don't know some of the lesser known presidents. And today, for the fifth president, we are talking about James Monroe. He was our fifth president. This is him. Well, a portrait of him. We really didn't actually have a actual photograph of a president or a former one until John Quincy, who will be our next one, which is this guy, which I'll be sure to get a little copy of the photo. He was the first president to actually be photographed. So before that, we don't really have any photographs. But James Monroe is who we're talking about today. And he's definitely, in my opinion, definitely probably one of the better and greatest presidents that we've had. Because as I've heard mentioned in some historical documentary series, some of the things that have occurred is a list that maybe James Monroe wasn't exactly the best of presidents because, he was nothing really important happened. Well, there was important stuff that happened, but the general reason that James Monroe is not considered in most Americans' minds when they think of great presidents is because most Americans will think of a president who had to endure with a certain political crisis or certain war or something major, a conflict, something that was a major event in American history that they had to deal with. And they constantly will rate presidents due to how they handle crises. Well, what about the presidents that didn't have to handle crises? What about the ones that just had an enjoyable, peaceful presidency and maintained peace? What about them? Although that might not be as noticeable and might not be as significant to most Americans, let's think here. That is still an accomplishment to have stayed out of any kind of conflict or trouble and kept the nation on a peaceful path. So that's still an accomplishment. And James Monroe was definitely the first president to really accomplish this. Now, one thing I'm going to establish here as we go on is James Monroe is going to generally, he marks the end of a transition period of presidents to most scholars. To most, he's considered to be the last of the founders. And this was because he's the last of the people that was an adult age during the American Revolution, actually fought in it, that became president. He was the last of the old founding fathers to become president. After this, we have new Americans who, although they might have been little kids and grown up during the time of the Revolution, they really didn't mature until after the United States had actually been created. Monroe was definitely one of the last of this period, of this very first initial period of presidents. And he was the last of the Virginia dynasty of presidents, where most of the first five presidents, every one of them but John Adams, had come from Virginia. John Adams came from Massachusetts. He was the only one out of the first five to not come from Virginia. George Washington was from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and now James Monroe. We're going to go ahead and go in here today. So, to start out, I always like to give a little background as to the political figure's significance. So, for James Monroe, he was born on April 28th of 1758 in Westmoreland County, Virginia, to his parents of Spence and Elizabeth Monroe. Spencer and Elizabeth Monroe. Spencer was a farmer and a carpenter, and very oddly, Westmoreland County, as we mentioned where he was born, that's actually the very same county that, if I'm not wrong, George Washington was also born in. I don't know if that's where he lived in later in life, but I think that is where he was born in. He was born in the same county that Monroe would later be born in. Now, Monroe, as mentioned, his father was a farmer and a carpenter, and back then it was a common belief that you would follow up in your parents' footsteps. Monroe entered college at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, which was the colonial capital of Virginia, in 1774 at the age of only 16. Now today, you're like, no, why would you go to college at 16? Rules were a bit different back then. Let's also keep in mind that back then there really wasn't high school. There was no concept really of high school. There was higher education, and that was college. There was really no such thing as high school. If they even had a generalized schooling thing, it usually at the highest would only go up to about 8th grade. There was no 9, 10, 11, 12. So at the age of 16, you could be applying to a college if you had the money. It was more for the privileged and wealthy who could actually afford it, of course. Now, Monroe goes to the College of William and Mary, which you may also remember is the place where Thomas Jefferson also attended. And if I'm not wrong, I think James Madison also might have gone there, but Thomas Jefferson in particular was a graduate of the College of William and Mary. And Monroe goes there. That's where he gets his higher education. However, only 2 years later, he drops out of college. Not due to his slacking grades, which we don't know if he had slacking grades, but anyway, not due to poor academic performance, but due to the factor that 2 years later, the American Revolution has broken out. It is the first year into it. It breaks out a year after Monroe enters college in 1775. The revolution starts in April, and the Continental Army is asking for volunteers. Monroe was very much a patriot. He was not a supporter of British taxation. He was very much with the colonists in their struggle, and at the age of 18, he went ahead, dropped out of college in 1776, and joins the Continental Army. During the war, during the American Revolution, Monroe served directly under General George Washington, so he knew Washington very much. He was served under George Washington himself. He was in Washington's army. He fought in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, and was wounded at the Battle of Trenton on Christmas Day of 1776. Actually, I think it was the day after. Yeah, December 25th or 26th, one of the two dates. But anyway, he was at Trenton when George Washington and the rest of them crossed the Delaware River to surprise the Hessian forces that were encamped in the town, and he was actually wounded there, but he did live. He was wounded but lived. He did not severe enough to kill him. And then he also participated. Monroe was also present at the Continental Army's wintering at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania during the winter of 1777 to 1778. So Monroe got to see some of the big significant things of the war. And if I'm not wrong, I believe he was also present at Yorktown. Possibly. No, he was not. I got that wrong. No, he was not. But he got to be witness to a lot of the early accomplishments of Washington. He was present at Trenton. He was present at Princeton. He was present at Valley Forge. Monroe fought in the Revolution as a Continental Army soldier, thus making him a veteran. Now, during the war, Monroe did meet another famous founding father who would eventually become one of his lifelong friends, and this was none other than Thomas Jefferson. And in 1780, Monroe left the army to begin studying the law under Thomas Jefferson. They became very good friends, and they were friends until Jefferson's death. Jefferson died before he did. So keep that in mind. The past two presidents, as we discussed, well, not now past two, Thomas Jefferson becomes president in 1801. He beats the Federalists and gets 2 terms. In 1809, his protege and best friend James Madison gets it. He stays in their office until 1817. Now James Monroe is in office. He is of the same political party, he's of the same political mind as that of Madison and Jefferson both. Jeffersonian politics end with Monroe's presidency, because at the end, something happens with the Democratic Party, or Democratic-Republican Party, that we're going to discuss in the next presidential video. The party kind of breaks up. And we might touch a little bit of it here at the very end, but he's also the very last of the Jeffersonian presidents, those who followed directly in Thomas Jefferson's political philosophy. So, in 1780, Monroe he withdraws from the Continental Army, he starts studying law under Thomas Jefferson, and thus he gets a expertise in law. He becomes like a lawyer, he becomes a politician. In 1793, Monroe built this is a fun fact in relation to Jefferson. In 1793, Monroe built his Highland Plantation home. He built that next to Thomas Jefferson's Monticello home. So he's neighbors to Thomas Jefferson until Jefferson dies. Now, after the war, Monroe got involved in politics, and he became a delegate to the Virginia Assembly in 1782, and he was a representative for Virginia in the Congress of the Confederation, which was under the Articles of Confederation, the first government the United States had between 1781 and 1789. He was a delegate for Virginia in that. Now, as we all know, the Articles of Confederation kind of got outdated. They weren't working. The American people decided we need to change them. And in 1787, they write the Constitution. So that eventually gets rid of the Articles of Confederation. In 1786, Monroe married Elizabeth Cartwright, who was the daughter of a New York merchant. Together, they had 2 daughters, and they had 1 son. Unfortunately, the son died when he was a baby. He died during infancy. Now, although Monroe had originally supported James Madison's call for a new U.S. Constitution in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, he eventually turned against Madison's viewpoint. He broke away from Jefferson and Madison, and he broke away saying, no, we don't need the Constitution. We shouldn't adopt it. And he broke away from it because he argued that the Constitution did not sufficiently protect individual rights, which was a big issue when the Constitution was first proposed as the finished product. And eventually it became such an issue that in order to have all the states ratify it within a couple of years after the adoption and ratification, Congress had to pass the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, because this was to assure those who were the Constitution didn't protect individual rights. Well, now we have a piece of paper deliberately stating that we are doing just that, if it will make you people happy. Which I think is actually a good idea, just so there is an actual paper copy. If they didn't include it in the Constitution, well, yeah, you can assume that people would know that, but if you ever get a dictator that comes along that just decides they want to forego all that, well, you can't really argue the Constitution has proof of that because the Constitution has no textual support to support your argument at all. So by providing an actual written Bill of Rights, you're providing just that. Now, regardless of this, shortly after the Constitutional Convention in 1790, Monroe became a U.S. Senator. He was one of the first U.S. Senators representing Virginia in the U.S. Senate, and there he often sided with his friends James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. Although he had opposed them with the Constitution, he eventually came to side with them again in politics. Monroe was a founder of the Democratic Republican Party during the 1790s, which was primarily formed by Madison and Jefferson, but of course, being Monroe was a good friend to both of them, he very much fell into line with that. In 1794, Monroe became the U.S. Minister to France under President George Washington, who appointed him to the position, and he would serve into that position until 1796 when Washington asked him to, what would be the word here, step down. In 1799, Monroe became the governor of Virginia, and he helped to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 at the request of Thomas Jefferson, which, if we do not remember, the Louisiana Purchase is what gained us Louisiana and most of a large chunk of the West. It more than doubled the size of the country, and it was very much for a cheap price. So Monroe he played an integral part in negotiating with the French that financial deal of land. So he was very instrumental in that actually occurring, more than Jefferson was, to some degree. Now, shortly after this, shortly after his time, after this, he became a minister to Great Britain, also under Thomas Jefferson, if I'm not mistaken. And he helped to negotiate a treaty that helped to strengthen the Anglo-American bonds. But this was turned down by Jefferson and Madison. Now, let's keep in mind the political climate here. Monroe was instrumental as the minister of Great Britain of negotiating some 8 treaties with Great Britain between 1801 and 1809 that tried to alleviate tensions between the two nations and try to create some sort of alliance, some sort of bond between the two nations. Unfortunately, this was not popular with Thomas Jefferson, and it was not popular with James Madison, his 2 closest friends in his own party, and with a majority of Americans, because the British were not doing anything to halt the process of impressment that they were doing on the high seas, where the Napoleonic Wars are raging in Europe. The British Navy needs more men, and there's men deserting. They're running out of men at home. So what do? They start stopping and seizing American merchant ships and any ship on the high seas, except I think for warships. But sometimes I think they did that. But anyway, they start seizing American ships in the high seas, board them, claim that they are either deserters on those ships, Yeah, that's exactly what they did. They claimed that there was the British deserters on the ships. Now, sometimes there were, but most of the time these were fully born Americans. Took them home and forced them into service into the British Navy to fight the French. So they're deliberately using Americans as a source of impressed labor for their navy. They're kidnapping American sailors, basically. And this, of course, was not okay with Jefferson. This was not okay with the majority of the American people. And although Monroe had worked out trade agreements with these negotiations, the British in no part promised that they would end that practice, and thus Jefferson was not very pleased at all with the result. So he turned down the treaties that Monroe tried to bring to the table. Now, in 1808, Monroe, who's at this point a little bit distanced from Jefferson and Madison due to his viewpoint and his actions, and may I also keep in mind that it was during the French Revolution that under George Washington that Monroe also got to serve in France, and he actually was a witness to that. So he also adopted some of the policies that Jefferson later would out of his experiences of witnessing the French Revolution, such as laissez-faire, the hands-off approach to the economy. In 1808, Monroe ran for president against James Madison, and he lost. He didn't gain it that year. Madison won the presidency. He ran for the Democratic-Republican nomination. He didn't get it, and he lost the election. In 1811, Madison asked Monroe to come back into the field of politics to become his Secretary of State, and which Monroe happily accepted it out of his old friend despite their differences, and he would serve in that until Madison's presidency ended in 1817. He was also the Secretary of War during 1814 to 1815. He's the only individual in American history to ever hold, if I'm not wrong, he's the only individual in American history to actually have to hold two cabinet positions at the same time. And this was during the later half of the War of 1812. Now, in 1816, Monroe ran against the Democratic-Republican candidate for president, Federalist Rufus King. Now, by this point, the Federalist Party is in decline. They're dying off. And this will be the last presidential election they actually field a presidential candidate. After the War of 1812, where the Federalists had been very much an anti-war pose, they had even at one point Federalists in New England had proposed seceding from the Union and breaking away because they didn't think it was serving their interests anymore. There's very much, after the war has been won, well, not won, but come to an end, and the United States comes out alive and relatively not that bad off, there's a lot of Americans who begin to see the Federalists as unpatriotic. They start to see the Federalists as traitors, and they no longer are willing to really politically support them anymore. So after the War of 1812, the Federalists kind of gradually die off, not only due to that, but due to the factional sections within their own party, and by the early 1820s, the Federalists are now extinct. They're done. The Federalist Party, which had formed in the 1790s along the Democratic-Republican Party, which John Adams had been a member of, was now basically done by the early 1820s. It died off during James Monroe's presidency. This was I'm trying to think here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That marked 5 elections in a row for a president they had lost by this point. That they proposed a candidate, put a candidate forward, and they lost. So James Monroe's first election to the presidential office for his first term was significant in the fact that this was the last time there was a Federalist candidate against him. The end results ended up being out of a total of, look here, I got my election charts. I'm looking at the total number of electoral votes, because remember, the Electoral College grew as more states got admitted. In 1816, the Electoral College had a total of 183 votes. So, if you need a majority, I don't have a calculator on me at hand, but we don't even it's not a slim margin at all, so I can tell you this will certainly, we don't even really need the majority. It's not a slim margin. Monroe had landslide election wins, contrary to the one President Trump tries to claim that he had in November, which I hate to tell him this, not a landslide. You lost. And know what's oddly funny? 4 years ago, you had the exact same results that Joe Biden had, and you claim that was a landslide. It was, because you won. But now that you lost, it's not. And it was actually supposed to be you. No. I mean, no. But anyway, James Monroe definitely had a landslide victory during his 2 terms in office. But anyway, in 1816, Monroe wins the presidential election against the Federalist Rufus King by a margin of, out of 217 votes, James Monroe wins 183 of those votes. Rufus King only takes 34. So basically, if you want to put this by the popular vote, James Monroe got 68.2%, almost 70% of the popular vote, while Rufus King only managed to get about 31%, about 30.9. You really need an average here out of percent of the Electoral College. 84% of the Electoral College votes went to Monroe, 16% for King. Here's your map of which states went to who. You can see that the only last vestiges of Federalist power is up in New England, where they were strongest. That's pretty much the only area where they still exist. Every other bit of the country is now going pretty much for the Democratic Republicans. And as you can see, we got a new state by that time that was made during the War of 1812, Louisiana. And Indiana was a fresh state, like only a year old at the time. Actually, that very year it became a state. So this was the first election Indiana got to participate in. So James Monroe becomes president and takes office during his inaugural on March 4th of 1817. Now, Monroe's inaugural is significant because this is the first one to actually be held outside, like commonly is today. He's the first president to have an outside inauguration, and his inaugural address is also the very first to be public, open to the public. They can all come and watch. Now, the country was fresh with confidence at this point from the War of 1812, where although the United States hadn't won the war, they hadn't lost it either, and they come out relatively on good terms. They had gotten no territorial changes, but they hadn't lost anything either. And very much this was to the betterment of the American people. They had a very good feeling that we had whipped the British, even though we really hadn't. We had officially confirmed our independence on the American continent, and we are now free to expand our territory westward. We are now free to try to establish ourselves on this continent and establish ourselves for the nation that we know we ought to be. This brings in the era of good feelings, as it's often been called, during James Monroe's presidency. And this basically saw a cease to political infighting as well, because the Federalists basically dissolve away. The only major other political party is basically gone, leaving only the Democratic Republicans in place. So there's really no political infighting, nothing like what you see now. And then, of course, the Americans are very much, their morale is boosted, their optimism is up. Now, an early problem for Monroe was the issue of cross-border attacks by pirates and Native Americans from Spanish Florida into Georgia. Now, this had been going on for a couple decades by this point. Spain had never really controlled Florida, at least for the past couple decades. It had not, although Spain did claim ownership of Florida, it really didn't have control. And there was, of course, cross-border raids all the time of these escaped slaves that were coming in that had gone south and lived with the Native Americans. They were Native Americans coming across, like the Seminole. And then, of course, you had pirates, which were still active at that time. Not the grand pirates like Blackbeard and stuff. That was like 100 years prior. But they're still haunting around Florida, and they're coming up into Georgia at times, which is attacking U.S. soil. So in 1819, Monroe and his Secretary of the State, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, purchases Florida from Spain for about $15 million. Nope. Is it 15? I'm trying to read what I wrote. It's $5 million. $5 million. My bad. $5 million they purchased Florida. And they also signed a treaty with Spain called the Adams-Onis Treaty. And in this treaty, they formalized a border between of the Louisiana Purchase and New Spain, the Spanish colony of New Spain, which was still in North America at that time. Which, if you really want to see a image here, we got this to show kind of the territorial things. Right here we have the Florida Cession, which not only includes Florida, but the Spanish also kind of gave up the southern portions of Alabama and Mississippi, like where Mobile Bay is. This was the Florida Cession, what we gained in 1819 through the Adams-Onis Treaty, and then also finalized the border between the Louisiana Purchase lands that the United States had acquired and the Spanish territories of New Spain, which is at that time including what is now California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado and Wyoming, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. So this border is basically finalized, this border right here. Now, James Monroe was also quite present in trying to get some other territorial disputes solved, such as the signing a straight line with the British up to this point to the disputed Oregon Territory, which is pretty much the straight line border of Canada today, and getting this portion of land claimed for the United States as well, settling that dispute with Britain as well. But in any form, that we get Florida finally, and Florida is now in American hands. Now, 1819. Now, before we go further here, I forgot to mention that as Monroe started his presidency in order to gain confidence with the American people, in order to give them a feeling that he is their people's president. He goes on a nationwide tour, and he visits every single state and goes to most of the major cities in the nation. Immediately after he takes office, he does this. And this, of course, boosts his popularity to levels unseen for a president, because no president has ever actually toured the entire nation before. And he actually ends up doing this twice during his presidency, once during his first term and once during his second term, which nowadays is something that some other presidents have sometimes attempted. If I'm not wrong, I think Joe Biden is actually getting ready to, or it might be already doing so, something very similar to that. But Monroe was the first president to actually visit every single one of the states that was in existence at that time in the nation, to boost his popularity, to give the people a positive message that we are one people, we're united, we are going to move forward. In 1820, well, not 1820, 1819, the same year that we get the Adams-Onis Treaty signed and we acquire Florida and we settle a border dispute with Spain, at the same time, this also marks the start of a 4-year economic downturn, a recession, if you will. And this is caused by the diminished trade between the United States and Europe and their overborrowing speculators on the stock market. Which, yes, there was a stock market at this time, it's just at this time it was not electronic in any form. I know, that's probably hard to believe. You had to do stocks by paper. Yes, very hard. That means you're going to be doing a lot of math. You don't have a computer with a calculator to do it for you. So learn your arithmetic. In 1820, a year later, during this, Monroe signs the Missouri Compromise, which I covered about a year ago, but I will recommend the video at the end of this one just so you can watch it in case you have not seen it. And that was actually, I think, one of our first videos, but last year would have been the 200th anniversary of, and that's why I did it. But anyway, the Missouri Compromise is signed in 1820 with Monroe's blessing in order to prevent civil war from occurring between the North and the South, which is starting to become factionalized, by admitting the territory of Missouri as a slave state, and the northern part of Massachusetts, the Maine territory of Massachusetts, as the state of Maine, as a free state. Now, keep in mind, at this time, this was done because as more states got added to the Union, you had states in the North that were non-slave states, and you had states in the South that were very much pro-slave states. You could have slavery in the southern states, but you couldn't have it in the North. And they wanted to keep a balance in Congress. Well, Missouri, the reason that sparked with Missouri was not so much the balance with Congress, but the other end that really sparked it was the fact that Missouri was a little bit further north than most of the traditional slaveholding states, except for maybe Kentucky and Virginia. And this set up a little bit of a dispute with the American people in the North because they argue, well, how far are you going to let slavery expand? And in order to try to limit slavery but allow it to still expand, they reached the compromise that there was two parts of this compromise. You would get Missouri and Maine admitted as a state for each side, thus maintaining the balance of states in Congress that are pro-slave or anti-slave. You would have that pro-slavery, anti-slavery balance in Congress by admitting one of each. But the other provision was that the southern border of Missouri would act as a defining line as to where slavery could be expanded to in future territories. So let's use this as a factor. In the Missouri Compromise, it was said that future states, with the exception of states already created and Missouri, future states in the future would no longer be able to have slaves if they were north of Missouri's southern border. Any territories that were south of that line were open and pro-slave territories. So, for example, here, we'll go back to our map. We have Missouri here. Missouri can have slavery, but any territory north of its southern border here with Arkansas, what will become Arkansas, cannot have slaves. So any of this, off limits to slavery. Anything down here, pretty much can. So, like, that would include what will eventually become Arkansas. That will include Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and maybe part of Southern California if it had ever been stayed that long and extended that far, which it never did. But in this case, that is why Arkansas became a slave state. That's why Texas got to be a slave state. That's why Florida got to eventually become a slave state when it was finally admitted, because it was south of that line. Anything north was forbidden. Now, eventually, the 1850 compromise kind of wiped that out, but this was the first significant step to try to prevent a civil war and to appease both sides. And so for that, it did work for the time, and it kept a balance for a couple decades. So it did stave off what could have been much worse. So in that regard, Monroe had a great accomplishment, even though it was really only preventing the inevitable. So that, we had that, and I will have that video at the end here in case anyone wants to watch it. Okay, so we covered 1820. So 1820 is also the re-election year for Monroe. He runs for president, and he runs unopposed. Remember, the Federalist Party is basically collapsed by this point. There's no major political party to even challenge Monroe to put a candidate forward. And in 1820, he runs unopposed, and he wins every electoral vote but one. Keep in mind, only one president in history has ever actually won every single electoral college vote, and that was George Washington. Monroe gets that close to repeating that. He misses by one vote, and the legend is that the one elector that voted no to Monroe didn't do so because he didn't like him, but the legend is that he only did so to preserve George Washington's status as being the only president to be elected unanimously. Not that he didn't like Monroe, but just to preserve some sort of a historical significance for President Washington as a remembrance out of him. So that is the legend, at least. I'm not going to say that we know that it is particularly all the way true, but that is the legend that's been passed down, is that the only reason he didn't get that one vote was because someone wanted George Washington to have the only distinction of winning every vote. So for the 1820 election, pretty much it's very simple math. Every electoral vote but one, who cast it for his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who wasn't even really a candidate, went to Monroe. Every vote. Name me a president that can accomplish that now. Now, during his second term, Monroe very much focused on exerting the power of the United States in the Western Hemisphere, and it was through this he accomplished his most significant accomplishment during his second term. As we all know, presidents usually don't have as good of a second term, and Monroe did, because he got one very important thing passed, or at least not really passed, but created, that has had a legacy that even is still in use today. And that is none other than his Monroe Doctrine of 1823. Now, what the Monroe Doctrine is it declared that the age of European colonization in America was over, that the New World was now off limits to any further attempts by Old World powers, such as Britain, France, or Spain, to colonize it. That the Americas, North and South America, were now off limits to further European colonization. They were not to be thought of for colonization, and that any nation that dare try to do so, the United States reserved the right to basically attack those nations. That the Americans were basically the protector of the Western Hemisphere, and they would try to force any European nations out that tried to colonize them. Which at this time, the United States really didn't have either the military or the naval strength to really actually enforce it. And here's a fun fact that I actually recently learned out, that the only European nation that seemed to have no problem with the Monroe Doctrine was Great Britain. And Great Britain actually wanted to issue a joint statement with the U.S., but of course most Americans weren't willing to do that because of the recent memory of the War of 1812, just less than 10 years prior. So they didn't issue a joint statement, but the fun fact is, as I mentioned, the United States really didn't have the military power to actually enforce said doctrine at the time. So for the first couple decades, ironically, Great Britain was actually the one doing the enforcing with their use of their navy. They were actually the ones doing most of the enforcing of an American policy. Until the United States could actually grow up its military strength, Britain was the main person actually enforcing this doctrine. But it's an important precipice and piece of political policy because it is transcendent and gone through even today. It's still in use today. Presidents have used it for justification for many different interventions in foreign nations in the Western Hemisphere, from Theodore Roosevelt and William McKinley using it to justify the building of the Panama Canal and like basically fomenting revolution there, from Colombia, from entering the Spanish-American War that we talked about in another video, where we had basically Americans used Monroe Doctrine to try to dictate that Spain was interfering in Western Hemisphere affair by trying to keep Cuba as a colonial possession. Thus, we tried to help them. It goes on. And then Ronald Reagan, during the 1980s, if we don't recall, during his incursions into Grenada and Nicaragua, he also used that doctrine as a justification. And even now, where we're trying to help Venezuela out, and we're saying that Russia and China are trying to influence Venezuela, well, that is an example of outside intervention that the Monroe Doctrine basically says that we have a right to stop. So the Monroe Doctrine, although most of Monroe's policies are probably not really thought of, that one is very much a done deal. The Monroe Doctrine is very much a policy that is still in play today in American policy, in American political policy making and foreign policy. It's very much still present. It's still very much alive. Now, in return for the European nations keeping their colonial, greedy little hands out of the Western Hemisphere, Monroe promised that he would keep the United States out of European territories and any wars in Europe, that the United States would not get involved in basically European territory or European affairs. Now, Monroe's presidency did see the beginning of plans for transportation infrastructure of the nation, a national transportation system of roads and canals at the time, which, regarding the canals, we're going to talk about them in, basically, we're going to talk about the infrastructure plan in John Quincy Adams, which will be our next one that we do. I don't think that's going to be at least for another 2 weeks, or maybe a week. Yeah, it's going to be at least 2. But anyway, we will talk about the infrastructure program more then, because that actually tries to get more enacted by him. But the canals, I am doing I live here in Ohio, and we had 2 different canals in the summer. I plan on trying to photograph as much of the remnants as I can, but I'm also doing research into them. So at some point, if anyone watches this from Ohio, I'm going to do 2 little videos on the 2 canals that we had here in Ohio. We had the Miami and Erie and the Ohio and Erie. But eventually that will come about. But that was first conceived really during Monroe's presidency, to have these canals built as part of a new national transportation system that would better link and connect the nation. His administration also saw the admission of 5 new states to the nation. He saw the admission in 1870, and this went in consecutive order. Remember, it was slave state per free state. So you got a slave state, you're going to get a free state. Trade-off. So in 1817, you had Mississippi, slave state. 1818, Illinois, free state. Alabama in 1819, a slave state. Maine in 1820, free state. And Missouri in 1821, you had a slave state. So in total, 5 new states got admitted during Monroe's presidency. You had Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Maine, and Missouri. Now, after serving 2 terms, Monroe left the presidency. He didn't run for a 3rd one. Remember, at that time, you still could. He chose not to. And he left office in 1825. And then retired to his Virginia home, where he later helped to rewrite the new state constitution for Virginia, which, if I'm not wrong, I think James Madison also partook in. Now, when his wife Elizabeth died before he did, she died in 1830, 5 years after he left the presidency, and Monroe then moved to New York City. He left Virginia because Elizabeth was really the one that liked to live down south. Monroe never much cared for it. So after she died, he moved up to New York City with his daughter, and that's where he lived until he died on July 4th of 1831 at the age of 73. Keep in mind that he It's also ironic that the last of the founding presidents, last of the founding fathers to become president, is also the last of the presidents to die on the Independence Day. Keep in mind that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had died not only on Independence Day as well, but on the very same day of the same year, in 1826. They both died July 4th, 1826, just hours apart. Monroe dies on the same day, but not the same year. So he dies on July 4th, 1831, at age of 73. His body was eventually then, it was buried, I believe, in New York City at his daughter's house, or at least one of the New York City graveyards, but eventually was moved back to Virginia, to Richmond, Virginia, in 1858, just before the Civil War would begin. So that basically concludes for James Monroe, I believe. So right here, we look through that, and this, in case anyone wanted to know, this is a painting, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see it, of Rufus King, the last of the Federalist presidential candidates, because we're going to say goodbye to the Federalists, because they're done. The political party's done by this point. This was the last candidate they ever fielded for president in 1816. So, bye-bye, Federalists. But yeah, so that concludes our video, I think, on the 5th president, James Monroe. And as we mentioned, maybe not a whole lot of conflict during his presidency, but definitely he was one that helped to, really just try to keep a peace. He did keep a general peace in the nation, and he did succeed largely at foreign policy. He succeeded largely at expanding the United States a little bit and settling conflicts. He was not very much an action president because there wasn't really any major conflict or crisis that came up, other than maybe the Missouri Compromise. But overall, even though he was a peaceful president, he did a pretty well job. So that concludes for James Monroe, our 5th president. The next president we do will be on John Quincy. So goodbye, Mr. Monroe. So we will get to that, I'd say, in another 2 weeks, because I think next week, as I might have mentioned in the last video, I'm not sure I entirely did, but next week I'm going to do a video on the fall of Tenochtitlan, which it was the fall of the Aztec capital in 1821, of which this year, I just realized a couple weeks ago, this year actually marks the 500th anniversary of that historical event actually happening, of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, which basically led to the Spanish conquest of Mexico and the establishment of Mexico City. So we're going to cover that, I think, next week. And then either we'll do John Quincy Adams then, or I do have a idea that was actually recommended to me. I do not want to say what that is yet, because I'm still trying to decide whether or not I'm going to do it. But we do have a possible recommended topic to discuss. So I will, on the next video, we'll actually give an announcement as to whether or not we're going to do that at the point. But so that concludes today's video. So as always, like, subscribe, thumbs up, comments if you have them, questions, and what else? Oh yeah, suggestions, as always. So that basically concludes for today. I hope everyone has a good rest of their week, and we will see you all back here whenever not whenever, but next week when we get to the fall of Tenochtitlan. So have a good week, and God bless you all.